I'm pleased to have you here on this Friday lunchtime. And we are actually having a collection of really amazing architects. And this time is no exception. We've got Tom Emerson from 6A. And I have to say, I have actually had a crush on his practice for quite a long time. I am a huge fan of Milton Keynes Gallery and also South London Gallery. So we're going to see some good images of those, I know. This is our third talk in the Design District Meet the Architect series. And I should have actually said, I'm Jemima Burrill, and I'm the curator of Now Gallery and the cultural consultant for Greenwich Peninsula. So Tom, we'll come on to you in one more moment because I just wanted to flag up a little bit about the Design District. It's 16 buildings designed by 8 architects offering permanent, purpose-designed studio space for all. So Tom, very pleased to have you here. I think we're going to have a bit of a talk about, forget architecture. We're going to have a talk about film and art and landscape and other stuff. And kind of most importantly, I want everybody to get involved. So please, I'm sure you all know how to use your chat by now. Let's get some questions to us because we'd really like that. That would be fantastic. We're going to do about, I'm going to ask Tom about 6 questions and he's got about 100 slides. So we're just going to try and get through lots of stuff. And if it goes on too long, I will cut him off mid-sentence. So it's going to be fine. So get asking your questions. That would be really great. Tom, welcome. I can see you now. I'm going to put you on speaker view so I can actually see you rather than everybody else because I'm busy checking out everybody's living rooms as you do on Zoom. So, really lovely to have you here. So I wanted to first of all sort of talk about, well, it was Anthony Spira who I talked to, who's the director of Milton Keynes Art Gallery. And he said that Playtime is one of your favourite films. And watching it again, I can kind of see that the anti-modernist stance with Jacques Tatti's sort of extraordinary aesthetic could definitely appeal to an architect. And also he's incredibly playful. I mean, it's about play, and I think your work is playful, but it's also kind of ramping up a chaos. So I'd love you to sort of share your screen and talk through this bonkers film.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you, Jemima, and thank you so much for the invitation. Design District has been one of our kind of really exciting projects over the last couple of years. So really nice to be able to sort of share some of these things with you. But coming back to Jacques Tatti, indeed, Playtime and actually many of his other films are big favourites of mine. But I think I would slightly take issue with the often, I think, perception that he's anti-modernist. I think he is, I think he loves the modern city, the contemporary city, for a couple of reasons maybe, partly because he reenacts it so well. He does these sort of set pieces of the madness of contemporary life, or contemporary life in the 60s, so well. And also Monsieur Hulot, who's his kind of alter ego in all these films, is Jacques Tatti kind of playing himself, essentially. Here he is. He is never unhappy. And I think that if you look at films like Brazil or something like that, there's much more kind of stress, there's much more oppression, there's much more. Whereas in Tatti films, Monsieur Hulot is often confused, completely befuddled by the modern world. But he's not unhappy there. He's almost happy to be lost in it. And he has so many nice moments like these where he plays with the optics of the modern city, glass being as reflective as it is, transparent. And those are, I suppose, these are some of the qualities that we were looking for in Milton Keynes, because Milton Keynes is very much, of course, of that same period. It's one of these utopian places really conceived in the 60s that somehow uses the city, the grid, the idea of modernity as a kind of social project. And that's something that somehow felt very relevant when we're doing Milton Keynes. I mean, Tatti is a private passion, as it were. It's not something that that we kind of come back to over and over again in all projects, but maybe in Milton Keynes, Tattiville, which he built for this film, is probably this is, by the way, this is not true. This is my own edit of the lift in Milton Keynes, somehow being matching the one in Playtime, and the yellow does not come from Playtime, although it sort of rhymes. But I'll come on to that in a minute, where the sort of the colours come from. That's something else. But there is a kind of coincidence, which I guess is related to the city, Milton Keynes, Tattyville. Here, the back of the building, when you approach it as you arrive by car, again has the kind of yellow door. It's the kind of art door. So it's very much about this idea of the grid city, the kind of the metal sheds, these kind of boxes of magic. But it's also about the landscape, and this is the last building in the city grid, the Milton Keynes Central, the grid, and then it stops very abruptly and then leads on to Campbell Park, which is sort of orbital in its landscape. And so the building is essentially a meeting of this kind of landscape situation and then the urban one. And you can probably see it here. I keep on having my little bar covers half the pictures, but on the left there's essentially the circle of the park. You can see in this Helmut Jacobi drawing, very famous drawing of Milton Keynes. And then I don't know if you can see my arrow. Our building is here, right on the edge at the end of Midsummer Boulevard, overlooking the park. So it's this kind of meeting of city and landscape.
But he also, I mean, Jacques Tatti does like his roundabout. I mean, that fantastic kind of carousel roundabout. So it does sort of feel like it feeds through into. Yeah,
I think that they were maybe all kind of playing with in a sense, the possibilities of mobility and the fact that everybody would have a car, and that's, in Jacques Tatti's world, that's a new kind of dance. Because there's a sort of choreography to Tatti's work, which is really exciting, where everything is in motion. In fact, I think possibly the next one is even the illumination of the city, becomes a sort of a form of kind of performance and scenography as well. And then things like the neons, like the city at night, and the kind of the animation of the neons. And then there you can see on the right, they're the Milton Keynes neons, which again are not a reference to Tatti, but I think the coincidence is not surprising. In fact, the neons come from the iconography of the city itself. So this is a cover of AD magazine from 1974, where the city was kind of represented as this kind of illuminated neon heart. And that's something which I think we're going to talk about, kind of the artists we work with. This is really coming from Gareth Jones, and the replaying of the heart onto the building, the arrows, and that sort of nice kind of replaying of some of these themes. And one of the things that Tatti does a great deal as well is he kind of subverts and reappropriates objects. So a tire with leaves on it becomes a wreath, or this early postmodernism kind of great bin, the kind of your Doric bin, sort of also gets played out again in City Club, which is an artwork by Gareth Jones and Niels Norman, and we'll see them again. And the lamppost, which is then reappropriated as a sort of climbing frame. And in this little clip here, which was actually not at all staged, it literally happened in front of my eyes when I was there last summer. But it was also the best thing, because it suddenly saw that people could appropriate the city in the way that they saw fit. And it was just so nice to see kids just sort of like just seeing it as a kind of playground, there are little kind of steps on that lamp, but they don't go all the way up. It was it's the girl who decided that the top was the best place to be.
It also seems like it's about unexpected views, that wonderful view of the plate glass window in the Eiffel Tower, that it's just like you seeing something which you wouldn't ordinarily see, which I think we'll talk about later on, and I think is very much part of your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the sort of, some of it are the set pieces, like the big circular window and all those sorts of things. But then there are also then the consequences of those things. And many of those are kind of, you you can't predict completely. You can sort of set up the opportunity by which it might happen, but I think we're really interested in seeing, in a sense, how misused a building can be, how misused a place, or how new uses can overlay all the ones that were intended. So that's why when somebody sort of climbs up the lamppost, or an artist makes an installation in the wrong place, or that all those things somehow contribute to the work, and that's sort of contributes to the stories in the work.
Right, we are going to move on because I'm aware of the time, but we're going to talk a little bit now about the design district. So they're twin buildings, which I have to say I'm kind of fascinated with twin anything, but I don't know if you ever saw the Gregor Schneider piece, which is called, what's it called?
The Archangel thing.
Die Familie Schneider, and it was two terraces together. It was an extraordinary piece of work where you looked at them and they looked the same, and then you went in and different things happened, or almost the same things happened, but it was kind of macabre and quite dark. And it's always struck me that they work so well together because they were the same. But I think you've done something slightly different. They're the same but different. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there are lots of reasons, and some of them are sort of slightly more serious, some of them slightly more pragmatic, some of them slightly more playful. I mean, let's say that at a kind of very maybe slightly superficial level, when we were asked to do it, we were very excited about doing two buildings at the same time. And there was one thought was, well, what if we do two different buildings? What if one is better than the other? Then surely shouldn't you just do the better one twice? But then maybe a slightly more kind of precise answer is, if you can see this, the kind of the plan of the design district down here, maybe one of the things where our condition is slightly different to maybe some of the other architects is that both of our buildings are kind of inboard, so we have no edge buildings. And to some extent that meant that the conditions we were working with were more similar perhaps than if you had one that was facing the outside of the design district and one internal one. And I think that I was also then really interested in the idea of series and repetition and how that plays in the story of kind of industrial and working architecture. That actually one of the things that we really like about warehouses, for example, is the fact that there's this kind of regularity to them. And then there's a pragmatic one, which is that we could really focus on the smaller number of design decisions and really sort of try and get in quite deep with them, and that you could then reuse details, reuse things, and then really only play on the variations to it. And so you can see them here. So as pure structure, they're basically identical. There's some slight variation in the core, because of where you enter and exit them and things like that, but essentially they're the same thing. And what was really interesting about the brief, and maybe just in terms of variation, also we were aware that there were 7 other architects, so variety was not really needed from us. All we needed to do is do our buildings as well as we can, and then everybody else will do theirs, and then there will be variety coming out of that. So we didn't feel the need to kind of express these differently. But I suppose then the thing we're interested in was the kind of the commercial context of the master plan, and it's what you spoke about with Hannah. So if anybody didn't see it, have a look at it on YouTube. Hannah kind of presents the design district as an idea and as a master plan really super clearly, and there are all these very strict commercial and regulatory parameters, and we were really interested in sort of engaging super directly with those, and both in terms of construction, so the vocabulary of commercial construction, of a big contractor doing all of these, playing with, you could say, what you could call a contemporary commercial vernacular. And then things like the slant of the building, for example, which is maybe one of their most identifying elements, came from the fact that we started the project where the two buildings were just extrusions and then flat slabs. And that was it. That was kind of, and in fact, we ended up exceeding the amount of space needed and the ratios that were set up in the brief, because they had allowed sort of a little bit of slack for other things. And you see in the other projects, they've got other programs or inhabited rooftops. And so what we did is we just started tilting them until we hit the perfect moment in the kind of the Excel sheet of efficiency. And so that angle is in fact a kind of the product of a kind of algorithm, but it also then produces certain types of spaces, like these ones at the top are super tall and thin. These ones are sort of slightly broader, and then you have the broadest ones at the bottom, and so on. So you get these sort of the consequences are architecturally and spatially really interesting, and then it allows more light. This space in front of the building is in fact one of the bigger public spaces. So it's sort of the action was very precise, but the consequence was very broad.
I can't remember if it was Hannah or you who said, or even Matt Dearlove, who's the Director of Architecture at Greenwich Peninsula, that it changed, once you changed the facade, it actually changed the whole relationship, not only between your buildings, but between everybody else's buildings, and it actually produced a real shift.
Yeah, no, I think that this is going to be one of the things which I think it probably either comes from Matthew or from Hannah, because essentially, as the architects, we were literally kind of given our two plots and only that. Now, of course, many of the other architects are friends, so we know them socially, so there was a little bit of pub chat about what was going on in the other project, but there was no formal moment where we would sort of try and, I don't know, refine or deal with the adjacencies. Those are sort of the product of the master plan. So that's, which is really exciting, because actually, you know, things like, I think we're beside David Kahn on one of them, we're beside Adam Kahn on another, and you know, and these are all, you know, colleagues. I mean, all of the architects are people that we respect enormously. So to some extent, we were quite relaxed at not knowing what was going on beside us, because it's almost certainly going to be work that you know, that we appreciate a great deal. And then of course they're different colors, so that also, then you could say they're not the same at all. They're actually they're both kind of clad in super thin stone, like really, really thin, bonded to a thing. So it's very much the kind of the language of kind of commercial construction, but then with oversized gutters and sort of, we were really interested in the kind of the equipment that gets attached to architecture, the stuff that we normally try to suppress: fire escape signs, ducts, rainwater pipes, that all of that, grills. I'd say we've got like ventilation grills up here. All of that stuff is sort of amplifying it and making that the sort of the kind of expression of the architecture. And then really examining how some of these things come together. So like, what's this assembly, this sort of what is very normal, but then what happens when you get really close to it, while remaining completely within the kind of the, you know, they're not at all the sort of bespoke arts and craftsy things like some of the things that we've done. They're much closer to Milton Keynes in that sense, and they were going on sort of quite simultaneously. But you can see then some of the spaces that they produce.
It's always interesting as well. I'm just thinking of the Pompidou Centre, that wasn't it refurbished kind of recently, that, you know, how do those materials actually weather, and how they're going to kind of work in the future.
I think that how they're going to work in the future has always been the kind of something that we're really interested in. I think that's possibly even going to accelerate, given the, you know, the sort of period we're going through now, and places of work and how we use them and how we engage with them. So I hope that whatever happens, that people will feel like these are spaces that people want to be in and want to spend time in, regardless of how we organize ourselves in the future. And things like, you know, these opportunities, you know, it's a really unreasonable proportion of space to propose for a commercial building, but because it arrived out of this sort of matrix of constraints, it somehow, it sort of self-produced itself, and that was really a very exciting part of it. And then here you can see, this is the sort of the view from one, I think it's from the first floor, second floor, towards the other, and then really like the fact that the cranes are the same color as the dome, and all of that's nicely nicely aligned. So no, we've been
amazing. They do have incredible character, and it's going to be really interesting to see how they work with the other buildings. I think that it's interesting that you've all gone off and you designed them kind of in your own heads and gone on with it, but actually how they're going to have a relationship and a kind of conversation is going to be really good.
I think it's going to be totally fascinating.
Really exciting. Really exciting.
Like being between four of them, I think will be really sort of dizzying, but hopefully in a kind of really thrilling way. Like maybe we'll all feel a little bit like Monsieur Hulot, slightly confused by contemporary architecture, but in a kind of nice way.
It could be a real sort of testing point of 2020 architecture, to see how they all survive, and how they all look in the future. I think it's going to be quite a kind of significant thing of the really, and so kind of the moment. And
actually, and of course, I mean, maybe the most important thing, it'll be amazing to see them in use. I mean, I can't wait to see how like designers, makers, or how they kind of come and then do their thing, because they are undoubtedly going to change them. They will just by being there, the whole character of the thing.
They might put posters up. You never know. You're going to love it. They're going to be putting posters up and messing with your furniture.
No. Well, that's fantastic. And this is like one of the kind of pictures which was kind of important to us when we were thinking about it. Was on the top here we have the most banal kind of suspended ceiling and fluorescent lighting, which is sort of the world that we were kind of trying to think, okay, why does the world end up being the way it is? And then below, perhaps somebody who has engaged with that, let's say Richard Archwager from the 60s onwards, who did these fantastic pieces. The one he's most well known for is this one on the right, which is the table with pink tablecloth from the 60s. And that one exists in lots of different colorways. And it's all made out of Formica, and it's completely flat. And this sort of flatness of modern life was something that we were really interested in. But then later on, he also made these sculptures, I think they're called Archipelago, and which are essentially packing crates, and the kind of sculptural quality of packing crates. And some of our first renders, or first sort of interiors, were like playing out this idea of sort of, this is the riser here, made out of wood, but of course the riser then has to be fireproof. So then redid it in fireproof plasterboard, but leaving it exposed, and fireproof plasterboard is, luckily pink. And then seeing that these, this sort of unfinished world of commercial construction has a whole series of kind of figures and qualities to it, which may well be painted out, which may well be adapted by users, or it might be left raw. To some extent, I think we're quite happy to see how that kind of gets played out by different users. And
I think it's interesting. I mean, that sort of thought of raw architecture is an interesting idea. I mean, I also came back to the fact that you were described as an architect detective, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. And also, I was talking about it with Matt Dearlove, that you're also kind of a master weaver, that you weave stories and histories and narratives together, and you weave the surroundings into your buildings. Like with the Paul Smith, you've kind of you've taken a design from somewhere else and put it on the facade, but then you also kind of, it's also the relationship between, which in all your buildings you're dealing with boundaries between other people, like with the Juergen Teller studio. And I'm hoping you can illuminate a bit on being a bit of a weaver. Oh, also, I did love that you said that your son said you were a conceptual architect, which I was like, I came up with that. I was like, he's a conceptual architect, but obviously your son got there first.
Well, he that's what he calls me when he's teasing me for being too pretentious. So I have to take it with a certain with the spirit in which it's given, but it's fine. I mean, it's I think that the idea that there is a kind of narrative to the city, and the city kind of produces stories through its environments and the interaction between its environments, its population, and the events that somehow unfold. And I think that that's something that we are interested in, particularly in relation to history, so that history can remain kind of live and doesn't become a sort of a conservative or only conservation-led subject. And so things like this pair of images was from a gallery we did called Raven Row in Spitalfields, actually the weavers being an appropriate term there, as it was built for textile, for the textiles industry, for the silk trade.
I should have mentioned that is definitely another of my favourite galleries. I think, yeah, Alexander came up with, it was brilliant.
It was so amazing to be able to work on this. These two Grade 1 listed mid-18th century buildings, and everything that's happened to London happened to those buildings. So they have had this most incredible sort of witnessing of the story of London from essentially just after the Great Fire until now, the rise and fall of the East End and so on. And there were these amazing archive photographs, and this is one of them, which was unexplained. It was in the London Metropolitan Archive, and it's sort of the day after a fire ripped through the building. And it was one of the pictures, one of many, that became really important to us about, nobody knows how the fire started, nobody knows why, there are very few records of it, but there's this picture that shows the kind of Rococo detailing, the mid-18th century, that's so resilient, even after this fire, it's still there. And there's this sort of very beautiful kind of resilience to it. And it was a former colleague, actually, called Takeshi Hayatsu, a Japanese architect who we worked with for many, many years, who sort of said, well, that in Japan, they use charred timber as a building material because it's very resistant to seawater, but also to fire. It's a way of fireproofing timber if it's thick enough. And so we sort of tried to find ways of using this archive as a sort of source of kind of material strategies and so on. And on the right is a picture of the roof lights to the new galleries at the back of the building and so on. So this idea of reusing some of these stories, which are now absent. I mean, there's no sign on the building that says there was a fire here. It's all been fixed. But there is a kind of presence to things. And I think that that's, one of the things that we are interested in. In this project, which is a photography studio complex for Juergen Teller, there was this kind of old boundary wall. It's a very, very long, thin site, and with a boundary wall on one side. And this picture on the left, in fact, it was Takeshi who gave it to me, showed it to me many years ago, which is the repair of a column in a Japanese temple, where the timber column has obviously rotted because it's too, hitting the ground. And they've made a piece of stone, but in the shape of a timber joint. So there's the stone somehow behaving as if it was a piece of joinery. And that kind of material shift in the way that these two things, which are fundamentally different, like mineral and organic, sort of fuse together in the act of making, has always been very inspiring. Now, of course, we're in a sort of slightly dull bit of West London suburb here. So we're having to sort of somehow integrate with a bit of old brickwork. But nevertheless, that encounter between a pre-existing situation and a new one became really interesting. We could have knocked that wall down, but neighbours had climbing plants on it, and they built garden sheds. And Juergen, in fact, it was Juergen who said, "Don't knock it down. That's like really unneighbourly. Just build on it," even though it was more difficult. But nevertheless, it's part of the character of the place now. It's kind of the way that it kind of sort of holds on to this pre-existing bit. And then behind that wall, in fact, that wall is this bit of brickwork that you can see here, is where the studio is made. And in fact, that piece of structure belongs to it. So we kept a bit of almost like archaeology. And then the studio is a series of kind of interiors and gardens in a kind of non-stop sequence. You go inside, outside, inside, outside. And then that was it when it was nearly finished on the left, and about a year later on the right, where basically the garden, the landscape has basically taken over, almost completely.
I think the relationship between landscape and trees and urban, just the way that buildings and trees work together, we'll look at a little bit later. I just was curious about Juergen Teller though, and how it was working with an artist. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about also you working with artists within your practice, but actually as a client, how did you both get what you wanted?
He's great. I mean, fantastic client. Kind of in some respects, really fast, really visual, very precise about when something is right and when something is not right. And at the same time, somehow completely uninterested in the process. So plans, he took no interest in. In fact, they bored him stiff. And he said, like, do I actually have to look at this? And I said, yes, because it's going to be the building that you're going to use. But he was very interested in us being able to do our work. So as long as he'd set out what he needed really clearly, and it was very simple, his basic premise was, now you do your work. You're not going to tell me how to take a picture, and I'm not going to tell you how to do a piece of architecture. So no, he was great, and he was really uncompromising and really pushed everything. And then once it was done, he kind of misused everything. So everything that is kind of designed quite precisely and functionally according to certain needs, then is kind of flattened because it's all studio. So in fact, he texted me this photo very soon after the building was finished. I think it was during the Euro Championships. He's a massive football fan. And he had a hangover, I think, after a Germany game. And then he just texted me, goes, now I know what they're for. You know, these are the water butts to collect the rainwater to water the gardens and so on. And suddenly he realized that they were kind of pools that were pretty nice to chill out in. So he's always been really fantastic. And then so he uses, let's say, the one on the left is a studio, is the top lit, north light lit studio. Which in fact, during the days for this one, for example, he turned the artificial light on. He doesn't need to, but it changes the color. So you can see the blue and the yellow playing on each other. And then on the right, the subject is on the roof of the building, having just climbed up on a ladder. So there is no such thing as studio and not studio. You only have situations and environments. And so the whole building is essentially an unfolding of these landscape and architectural spaces, which then, one gets eaten up by the other. But you're always in this sort of kind of sequence. And then he's been working actually through lockdown because he's on his own there, and produced some amazing work, even kind of solo. But no, he was wonderful. He was very that was quite a sort of dreamy client.
I think he had a donkey in his studio space at some point, didn't he?
He has had a donkey. Yes, he's had actually lots of animals and foxes and so there's a kind of bestiary element to it.
Now I'm just going to let us know so that we're kind of aware about it, that it's 1:40. We kind of want to have questions by 1:45. Yeah. We've got 5 minutes, and basically the two questions that I want to ask you now are kind of key. So I'm just going to say, be a little bit speedy on them, just so that we have time for people's questions. And I hope everybody, you're going to get us some really interesting questions that we're looking forward to taking at the end. So this is really about artists, and I have to say that I saw your piece with Amelia Pica enclosure at Whitechapel, and just saw, So
this is Amalia. Yeah, no, that was wonderful. That was a really nice little project with collaboration with Amalia Pica for the Is This Tomorrow? So the kind of reenactment of the very famous 50s show, This Is Tomorrow, which were collaborations. And she's worked a lot in a kind of very sculptural way, but with non-human subjects, so animal life, and we were very interested in landscape. So we did a piece with her. It was a kind of blind date suggested by the Whitechapel, but it was wonderful. She's a brilliant artist and a fantastic person, which was really trying to examine the kind of the worlds created by humans for non-humans, particularly in relation to animal life in the countryside. So it was a piece called Enclosure, which was made up of all the sort of architectures that are made for animals, and it's to do with farming, to do with leisure, to do with and that was a really exciting, and it then became kind of quite a place.
Just to ask you one thing, did you see a piece by, it was Keith Wilson at Milton Keynes, which used the same material to make a piece of work?
No, but I heard about it.
That. Yeah,
I heard about it. Yes, I think somebody's mentioned that to me before. So this is all these sort of corralling structures for taking sheep to be weighed and to be washed, and but they're all sort of kind of also really beautiful kind of elements and constructions, and have a nice sort of sculptural quality and graphic quality. So there's Amalia and Owen from our office sort of tying up these. I think these are kind of play structures for seals. But then we also work. This is on the left, Gareth Jones, and on the right, Niels Norman, the two artists we worked with on Milton Keynes. And Gareth is from Milton Keynes and has a kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the place. And he is the one who brought in, let's say, a lot of those, particularly the colour references, but brought this deep, deep knowledge about the kind of the utopian sort of underbelly that is not necessarily always visible of the city. And so on the left, you have the studio where they designed Milton Keynes, and then, which is demolished now, which is an amazing thing, amazing building. And then that got replayed as part of City Club, which was a sort of public realm and interiors commission for the two artists. So the red structure, yellow furniture, black ceiling. And then also bringing in, so this is not a color chart, it's the urban planning toolkit. The left, you've seen all the colors on the left, they're the Metropolitan colors of the bits that I've shown so far. But then on the right are the sort of pastoral colors to do with the landscape. And so they ended up being used for things like the curtain in the auditorium and so on. And I think that they really brought another level of kind of cultural excavation of the city to bring back through into the project, into the playscape I showed before, and so on. So it was really fantastic, and they had a sort of different time frame for things, you know, when we're always under pressure to deliver. So that was a really kind of exciting part of the thing. But maybe I'll just flip through. So these are the kind of landscape. Obviously, is a really important part of it. This is a found picture. This is a member of the public came to one of the consultations, sent me this picture from the 1980s of the CND sign in snow in Campbell Park, which is the one on the right. And she said she thought the round window reminded her of the CND sign, which I thought was very nice. I thought we can take that. But then we did a project with Gabrielle Orozco in South London Gallery, this garden, the Orozco Garden, which actually was really led by my partner, Stephanie. Here's Gabrielle on the right as the path that leads from the gallery into the estate. And it's like...
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, so it's essentially, it's like a piece of sort of fictional ancient archaeology, like a bit of sort of Mexican sacred architecture found in the backyards of Peckham. And this is my partner Steph and Gabrielle, and that was a sort of really fantastic kind of process of exchange and sketches, drawings, materials, to do that. And it sort of brings a sort of different, I guess, a slightly different beat or different dimension to some of the projects when some of the participants don't have the same responsibilities.
I also wondered what kind of beat it gave the architecture if a woman was designing it. And the question that I had in my mind was that I'm interviewing all men for the Design District talks, which I find quite astonishing because generally there are lots of female partners. And what it is that basically is your wife potentially the power behind the throne, and what does she bring to projects?
She may well be. I think you'd have to ask that. I think that, I mean, I can't speak for the others because, but certainly in our case, so if, let's say, the talk was really focused around the garden at South London Gallery or the fire station, which is actually this one, then, and if you'd asked me to do it, I would have said, no, you need to ask Steph. Because that's a project that she really led. I mean, in the office we work together, and at home and all the rest of it. But then generally, once a project gets a certain momentum, it tends to be followed and led by one of us, even if we talk to each other. So let's say South London story would be one that she would probably tell with more intimacy and more kind of lived experience than perhaps I would. And so that it so happens to be that things like Design District and Milton Keynes, which were very much sort of a pair, are ones that, I mean, I haven't done on my own. In fact, Liam Ashmore, who was on the, who's been really the sort of the engine of the Design District. I saw his name was in this thing, so I hope I'm not making too many errors in my descriptions. But so for us at least, it tends to be that one of us will sort of be, you know, one step more deeply involved than the other. So, you know, if you ask about the community centre that we're doing at the moment, in a couple of years, it's just started on site, or in a year's time, then it's almost certainly will be Steph who will have the kind of the voice for it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to really move you on because we have got only 10 minutes left for questions. You've basically got 3 minutes on the rest of your slides. So we're going to talk about landscape, I'm hoping. And yeah, I know that you're kind of passionate about it in terms of bringing it as a theme into your work.
Yeah, I think that we're really interested in how architecture and landscape are engaged in one another, how essentially they sort of tend towards each other, you know, particularly with the ruins and stuff like that. You know, if you leave a building unoccupied, it will be recolonized. And in fact, so we're interested in the landscape, the climate, the weather, how buildings and landscapes belong to one another. You mentioned the Michael Landy drawings of weeds, I think from the early 2000s, which were, I remember when they were published in the Tate magazine, they're absolutely fabulous drawings of sort of, you know, the stuff that grows between. Oh, you've got one of them. Wow.
Yeah, just back there.
Actually, I love them. It was a very, very beautiful set that he did. And we work a lot with Dan Pearson. I mean, we're with several landscape architects, but with this one, with Dan Pearson, this is the Amelanchier, the tree that's come on so many times in these slides, in flower as a sort of super haircut, kind of crown for Dan. And we're really interested in this relationship between kind of growth and decay, and that it applies to buildings as much as it applies to natural landscapes, and that's something that is really important. Particularly these ones, which are the gardens, the kind of landscapes that grow spontaneously when people are not around. So these are both from sort of in the industrial sites or bombed out sites. They come from this book, which for us is incredibly important, the Fitter's Natural History of London, where he catalogues essentially all of the natural history in London. And he treats humans as part of the natural history. So whether it be Highgate Cemetery or these kind of great pictures of like Richmond Park, well, I mean, the deer are still there, or St. James's. The man on the right is, I think, extinct now, but the pelicans are still there.
They're still there.
They're still there, but the man in the bowler hat is not. These different types of habitats. So these are all really interesting. These are things like that are really interesting. And this last one is essentially the kind of lockdown tetrapanax, which is a plant that Dan uses quite often, Dan Pearson. Who work with, and it's outside our kitchen window. And every couple of days during lockdown, I took a picture of it, and just sort of, you know, as we were sort of confined to home, just suddenly realized, you know, that the the landscape, the seasons are not, they're not waiting around for us. They're just doing their thing, and they will continue to do their thing. And I think maybe that's sort of quite a nice kind of an important idea for us, that regardless of what you do, you'll never stop the weather, as it were.
I think it's so true, and I think that also in lockdown, what we're realizing is that small is significant. Like the shepherd's purse and the pavement, we enjoy it, or like my clematis with bright pink flowers. You really are kind of getting a sense of the small details. I think it'd be interesting also to think about lockdown in relation to public spaces, and how those are going to change. And I think that's a kind of massive conversation which we might not have time to do right now, but let's kind of open the conversation up to everybody who's here. I hope there's some good questions. Really look forward to hearing from anybody. Alex is from the Design District, and he's been looking at the chat. Give us some questions, please.
Yes, hello everyone. We've got some good questions for you, Tom. The first being from Helen, who asks, in an entirely new building, how can you bring in some patina in the way the studio project shows without being pastiche?
Well, patina, first of all, patina will happen on its own. You have to be patient. So to some extent, whatever you do, it will age. I think a friend of ours, the artist Richard Wentworth, once said, the first scratch is damage, the 1,000th is patina. So be patient. But sometimes you're right that you want to somehow try to get through that bit where you don't know whether it's damage or whether it's patina. And the project we did, and I just showed, for Churchill College in Cambridge, which is entirely timber building, there we used reclaimed oak from the railway industry. It was like the beds of freight trains, about not quite 100 years old, but nearly 100-year-old oak. And essentially it had done all its aging before it was used as a building material. And so once that came onto the building, it was already somehow kind of quite highly textured. And then there are some situations where essentially you don't want that patina in the same way. So let's say Milton Keynes is polished stainless steel, and it will probably stay polished and shiny for, more or less forever. And that's something that feels like it fits the situation. It feels like it fits to Milton Keynes' obsession with the future. Whereas Cambridge, which is a rather more ancient environment, somehow something that really has some sort of depth and past, felt appropriate. So I think it's sort of, I think the selection and treatment of materials is really fundamental act of design.
Okay, so bringing it back to the design district, Julia asks, did you have a specific creative field in mind when you were designing your buildings?
No, none at all. It's really hard. I mean, as you've seen, we've worked with lots and lots of different artists. We've worked with lots of graphic designers, lots of different types of makers. And if there's one thing that you can say for sure, is that none of them work in the same way. So to some extent, the only thing that they do is they tend to respond very profoundly and very directly to the quality of space in which they are engaged. So you try to make good spaces with good light, well ventilated, and after that, let them own it. And I think it's more interesting. I think second guessing how people use things is I think kind of losing business.
It's for them to kind of interpret the space and use it in the way that's going to work best for them. Yeah.
I was just, isn't it also though that you can never second guess your client. You never can really know where they're going to put their stuff or how it's going to work. If you design buildings thinking about how they might hang their coats, you're not going to design the building you necessarily want to.
Especially working buildings, because working practices are so particular to different fields, different trades, different technologies. So I think that things like the building I'm sitting in now, it was built as a builder's merchant in the late 19th century. Now it's been refurbished and stuff like that. The one thing that it does have, it's got great daylight and fantastic kind of ventilation. Like, you know, you can open windows on all sides, everywhere. I think it will be useful forever, regardless of what it's used for. It used to be our office, now it's our home. It was somebody else's office before that. It was a builder's merchant. So it somehow uses just go through places, and if they're good, they just endure and adapt, whether it be like the 18th century townhouses and Spitalfields on our galleries, or the fire station, which is not a fire station anymore, but is still a fantastic public building. No, I think that to me would be interesting to see. I'm really interested to see who uses it and how they use it.
Mm-hmm. So moving away from the design district, Rupert asks, he says, clearly art informed your architecture, but do you have another creative practice in your life beyond your profession?
Okay. Well, I mean, I teach a lot. I've been teaching for the last 20 years. So that's sort of, teaching is a sort of another vocation, you know. My partner, Steph, draws as a kind of independent practice. You know, in a sense, nothing to do with architecture, mainly to do with landscape, mainly to do with kind of natural history, portraiture, and so on. I write a fair amount, so kind of various kind of literary interests. So yeah, no, there's quite a bit, but luckily, I guess I'm quite lucky that most of it passes through my professional life in some ways, you know, or at least leans into it enough that I feel it. So I don't have anything that I would say is entirely separate.
I thought as an architect, you know, you had to live, breathe. You know, it was just your life. It was like a vocation that, you know, no space for anything else, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it does. It is sort of all around us, and particularly since we are a couple and run a practice together and stuff like that. So, you know, it can sometimes sort of be slightly unwelcomed, sort of third person in the room, as it were. But no, most of the time it's very exciting, and I think we're very lucky that essentially most of the things we do and that we like doing contribute in some respects to our kind of professional life, and that we've never really had to make boundaries. But, you know, I make a lot of stuff on the side, you know, which I don't do for money, but it's also related, you know.
So we probably have time for one more question, and then just to let everybody know, the questions that we get, we will then redistribute on Instagram. So please don't think that we're ignoring you. One more, Alex, one quick one.
Okay, there are a few more, but I think I'm going to go for, what is your favourite building in the design district that you didn't design?
Do you know what? It's always nice to know where they come from. Who asked this question?
That was a question from the team, if truth be told, and we're all intrigued. So
I thought that was a question from David Conn. I was really dreading this question. No, I could make one really good friend here and alienate 6 others. So who do I want to be really good buddies with? I mean, to be fair, quite a few of them are really good friends, and are people. In fact, some of them are people I went to college with and stuff like that. So I would say some of the ones that I genuinely, I'm really intrigued by what David Conn is up to. He seems to be having a kind of late Sterling turn in the early 21st century. And I think that's looking really, really kind of interesting. Maybe I'm saying that also because I know his work very well, and I've known him for a long time, so I know the evolution. I think that the Architecture 00 buildings, certainly on site, are kind of totally thrilling. The space, I've only been inside one of Hannah's buildings, but one of them has got this amazing ground. I don't know. I think that the person who asked the question knows that I'm not going to fall into that trap completely.
I think
I'm going to say that they're all winners and they're all wonderful.
Yeah, you're only lab one anyway. And so I think that's probably all we've got time for, but obviously we will answer all your questions anyway. Tom, it's been fantastic having you. I was just remembering a Richard Wentworth quote, which was about sculpture as a means of escape. He actually said he also has a talent to annoy people, and it's really important how not to be boring. Definitely not boring, but I also think it is that idea that your buildings kind of, you know, they make you escape. They make you kind of think of somewhere else, and that works brilliantly. So thank you so much for being with us. We have got a talk on the 3rd of July with Oliver Schultz, and I should know the practice name because I'm interviewing his wife as well for Now Gallery. Please come along then. We're so lucky to have such a bunch of, you know, fascinating architects to talk with. So Tom, thank you so much. And thank you all for giving up your Friday lunchtime.
Thank you all for giving up your lunchtime. Thank you. It's been really nice seeing the design district.